very happy to have with us tonight Professor Timothy Snyder, who is the Levin Professor of History at Yale and a permanent fellow at the Institute of Human Sciences in Vienna. And he will be in conversation with Smita Narula, who is a distinguished lecturer at Hunter College and the director of the Human Rights Program at the Roosevelt House.
I'd like to start by just saying something about the book. So the book, for those of you who are still unfamiliar with it, is a New York Times bestseller, and it explores the new threats faced by our political order and how we can look back to the 20th century for lessons on how to overcome these threats. 20 lessons in particular on how we can resist the decline into tyranny, drawn from our author's vast body of work on how the Europeans of the 20th century yielded democracy to fascism, Nazism, or communism. So Tim, I think it's fair to say that this book is a departure from your previous publications, all compelling, thought-provoking books that take a deep dive into war, genocide, and the descent into dictatorship in the mid-20th century. But here, we have an almost pocket-sized book, a manifesto, if you will, but not a manifesto for a political party or an institution or an organization, but for everyday citizens interested in defending our democracy from what you describe as profound threats to our political order. Tell us what led you to write this book in this style, and why now?
The book is a departure, but it's also an arrival. It's the first thing that I've ever really done as an American. I'm an American, of course, but my work has been on, as you kindly remember, has been on the 20th century in Eastern and Central Europe. And what happened is that some of the things I think I knew, or some of the things which were familiar to me from my historical work, suddenly seemed to appear in my home. One way to think about it is the it, right? The question, it can happen here, can it happen here? Which the answer is always yes, by the way. The answer to that is never no, right? But for me, I took for granted, having written about Nazi and Soviet terror in places and times not so different from our own, where the perpetrators and the victims and the bystanders were people not so very different from us. In some cases, they were our relatives, right? I took it for granted that the it could happen. And I took for granted that the it could happen to people like us because my teachers, when I became a historian of Eastern Europe, were people who had survived the Holocaust or had lived through communism, or in the case of my doctoral supervisor, both. And that's people like us. Our teachers are people like us. If he can teach me and I can have a conversation with all of you, that's people like us. And I think the third thing which was happening was that as a teacher of people who work on East European history, I was confronted with a younger generation from Eastern Europe, Russians, Ukrainians, Poles, Hungarians, who have been dealing with the things that we're dealing with now basically for their whole lives as adults. So many of the lessons that are in this book are from the experiences of people in their 20s who have seen after 1989, after that moment when history was supposed to be over and freedom was supposed to be easy and democracy was supposed to come automatically with capitalism and all that nonsense, who have seen rather democracy move away from them, their entire politically aware lives. So that's the third thing. So it can happen, it happens to people like us, and it's happening now, right? So I came to all of this looking at it from Eastern Europe historically, politically, contemporarily, and I recognized certain patterns in the Trump campaign. And so when he won, my first reaction was to try to translate what I thought I knew into recommendations about what we all can do.
You don't call the president by name in any part of the book. What was behind that decision?
There are a couple things. The first is he had been elected, right? He had been elected when I wrote the book. I wrote the book in December of 2016. I wrote the lessons in the hours and days after he won in November of 2016. And in that sense, it wasn't about him. I mean, there's a way in which, many ways in which, focusing on him allows us to dodge the problem. So if we say he is an aberration of the system, or if we say he's mentally ill, or if we say he's a historical blip, if we say any of these things, what we're doing is we're abrogating our own responsibility. I mean, both for the fact that he got elected in the first place, but also for how we have to react. So the point of the book, the reason it was so fast and so short, and also in a way so direct, was that I was trying to get us to act quickly while there was still time. If we spent all of our time trying to decide which way Mr. Trump is mentally ill, or exactly which form of racist oligarchy was going to be established, if we spent all of our time on that, waiting and analyzing, we were going to miss the moment which was politically relevant. So the book is not about him. It's prompted by him. It's prompted by things that he did. It's prompted by things like his urging his supporters to murder his rival. It's prompted by things like the violent character of his rallies. It's prompted by the way he uses the English language. It's prompted by him. But it's not about him. It's about us. It's about what the American Republic could be if it were defended.
So I wanted to segue from that, just going right into the first lesson of the book, and to really make this about us. Lesson 1, do not obey in advance. Most of the power of authoritarianism is freely given. In times like these, individuals think ahead about what a more repressive government will want, and then offer themselves without being asked. A citizen who adapts in this way is teaching power what it can do. What I hear you essentially saying is, do not consent to your own oppression, which is, I suppose, easy to say, but profoundly difficult to do.
Yeah, that's a lot of that's good. A lot of the things in this book sound very easy, and some of them are in fact easy, but a lot of them are harder than they sound. And there's a reason why lesson number 1, don't obey in advance, is lesson number 1, and that is that it's actually difficult. And if you fail lesson number 1, lessons 2 through 20 are irrelevant to you because you will never get there. Lesson number 1 requires you as an individual to do something which is unusual, which is to say, I as an individual define this situation as exceptional. I am drawing a line around myself and saying I am not going to act according to what's happening around me, but according to something which is within me. That is hard. People think they're free. Freedom is hard. And freedom is doing the thing that everyone else is not doing, right? It's not saying, I'm free, I live in a free country, yada, yada. Freedom is that moment where you lean out and you're doing the things that other people aren't doing. And that's lesson 1. And where it comes from is the study of Nazi Germany. So one of the few things that historians of Nazi Germany agree about, because they're a disagreeable bunch in general, but one of the few things they agree about is that that Hitler gained much of his power by consent, right? That especially in 33 and into the early 34, the regime was possible because people allowed it to happen, because people normalized what was going on around them. That's one of the few things we think we understand historically. Psychologically, the way it works is that we have a very strong tendency to follow rules, right? I mean, we're all following rules right now. Somebody's asking questions, I'm answering them, you're sitting, you're not square dancing. Usually we do what's expected of us, and usually that's appropriate. And the reason why this is psychologically hard is you have to say, I'm an individual, I'm actually going to break these norms that I'm feeling around me. And the other reason it's important is morally, to use an old-fashioned word, it's morally important because if you do obey in advance, not only do you help authoritarians come to power, but you become the person who helped them come to power, which means that for the rest of your life, you explain why it was that you had to do that. You become the person who makes the excuse for that person who obeyed in advance. And that's a phenomenon which is already, by the way, massive in American society 1 year on.
The second lesson you go straight into is to defend institutions. Institutions do not protect themselves, you say. So choose an institution you care about and take its side. Which of our institutions do you feel are either most vulnerable or most under attack? And are there any institutions that we need to transform instead of defend?
Yeah, great. So, I mean, let me say just a word about why this is number 2, because there is a kind of logic to it. The institutions have to be defended because individually we're hopeless. You know, one of the great American myths is that freedom means that you're that last person, like on a blasted heath somewhere, holding, you know, the automatic weapon and defeating the aliens, and that's freedom, right? Or to be more serious, give a more serious example from our culture. Holocaust movies are always about rescue, and it's always about the unusual person who carries out the rescue. And I work on the Holocaust, this is what I do, and it's true that there were some unusual people who as individuals saved other individuals, but in fact what mattered was institutions. In fact what matters was whether institutions were preserved or whether they were destroyed. That's what determined whether Jews survived or not. So institutions are magnifiers. Institutions are what allow us to be decent. They're what allow us to feel like we're not alone. Because if power actually gets you alone, then you're hopeless. And we love that photo of Tiananmen Square with the lone person holding back the tank, but he didn't actually hold back the tank, right? It's a beautiful image, but that's not how freedom actually works. So in terms of what's most threatened, I would say the fundamental institution which is most threatened, this comes later in the book, but it's factuality, which is like a pre-institution. Factuality, which is the realm of journalists and the realm of scholars like us, the realm of a lot of different people. That's the institution which allows all other institutions. Because if we don't believe there's truth in the world, if we don't believe there are facts, we can't cooperate. And then institutions become impossible. So, to be specific, journalists are under threat. There are institutions also which aren't under threat, but which just don't work, like checks and balances. It hasn't actually worked out that well, right? I'm all in favor of it, but unfortunately in this country we have, in the best, on our good days, we have a two-party system rather than checks and balances system. So if the same party is in Congress as has the White House, you can't really expect very many checks and balances, and we're not getting them. So the Congress hasn't failed, but it also it's not restraining the president very, very effectively. And then I absolutely agree, though, with the premise of your question. There are institutions that have to be renewed. This is a book about treading water. This is a book about how not to drown. This is a book about keeping the American Republic going, which I think is actually the correct way to frame the issue. The idea of the book is that if we practice some of the things that it recommends, then we would be better citizens and better able to form new institutions at the end. I think the institutions that need to be formed are largely the small ones. And it's heartening to see people doing that, whether it's the lawyers, a lot of them here in New York, getting together in NGOs, whether it's Indivisible across the country, whether it's small groups helping other people run for state office. It's the small things which have to be revived, I think.
The book to me was both very chilling and also very empowering, right? Chilling because you bring the weight and this depth of knowledge of history to bear and ask us to have an active relationship with history as we see our own history develop before us today. And that can feel very weighty, it can feel very chilling, yet you also call on us to engage in small everyday acts, making eye contact and small talk, putting away our screens and enjoying a long read. And lesson 13, practice corporeal politics. Power wants your body softening in your chair and your emotions dissipating on the screen. Get outside, put your body in unfamiliar places with unfamiliar people, make new friends and march with them. Could you say something about the transformative potential of small acts?
That's in a way what the book is all about. It's about the small acts which seem easy, but which in fact require a tiny bit of courage, and then the magnification effect that a tiny bit of courage on your part has for other people. Many of the lessons, some of them you've already mentioned, are about very simple things, like, for example, do you go outside or not, right? Do you just get angry over Facebook, or do you actually march? That for me is a really fundamental difference. And it's a choice, because Facebook actually takes up the energy that you need for marching. Even worse, it makes you feel like you've done something when at the end of the day you actually haven't. You feel tired and dissipated, and you're just dissipated. So that decision to go out and put your body in a new place changes the way you think, and it means that you end up meeting people that you wouldn't have met otherwise, which is generally not true of the internet. It also has this interesting quality that you might actually persuade someone. Not that that's easy. I feel like we've gotten to this point in America where everyone thinks we can't persuade anyone of anything else because we're all completely, we're in our own silos. But it's hard, but it's actually possible in real life. It's not possible with the internet, right? The Facebook exchange, which ends with someone writing, you have persuaded me with your rational arguments. That Facebook exchange has yet to happen. Even though I've been making this joke for like 2 years now, it still hasn't happened, and it won't. But when you actually talk to people in real life, like you talk to people who are a bit different, and they talk to people a bit different, and there's some chance that will make a difference. So little things like getting your body out and the making eye contact, I think is really, it's interesting. That's the lesson that has inspired the most questions in the years since I've written this book. Precisely that one, and it's, in a way, it gets to the essence of one of the things about this book, which is that it's about not sleepwalking, right? It's what you said about history. History, if we take history seriously, we can't sleepwalk.
You said, and in the book, and you've just said now, it can be organized on social media, but nothing gets real until it hits the streets. But not all protesters are treated equally. And in fact, the state's response to protest can be very racialized. And we've seen that, right? We've seen very disparate responses to protests depending on who's protesting. When white supremacists are allowed to walk freely brandishing guns and tiki torches, but peaceful Native American protesters or black activists are deemed black identity extremists or pelted out with rubber bullets and tear gas and arbitrary arrests, it makes the call to protest carry this very heavy weight and burden. And I just was wondering if you could say more about the burden of protest and sort of the racialized response to it.
No, I completely agree with you. I mean, you've captured in a way very well what I'm trying to say to people who might think, I don't have to protest yet. One of the reasons you have to protest now, if you're in a relatively privileged position, is that for other people, it's already harder than it is for you. And your presence on the streets will change the nature of the protest. I mean, this is an old logic, but everybody knows it. If you wait until you feel you really have to protest, the game is already over.
It's too late.
The game is already over. So you have to get out and do it first, partly for precisely this reason, so that it's harder to characterize it as being just some Americans and not all Americans. And pragmatically speaking, so that police react differently to protests. So I think it's really important for protests to be big, to be bigger than they are. And it's really important to always protest earlier than you think you have to. And this is true for everyone. I mean, this is such a good question because what happens, what has already happened in Eastern Europe and what happened in the 30s and 40s is that people wait to protest. They think, the privileged people in your categorization, they think I can always protest. But that's not true, right? It can be criminalized, right? Ask the Russians. You can get to a point where it's illegal, and then the nice law-abiding people will generally not protest at all, and then the game's over. So.
And it is being criminalized in various states. So I wanted to step back from the specific lessons and pull back a little bit to the premise of the book, which is that we're facing new threats to the political order. I have in my own conversations about these issues and in my own work as a human rights scholar and defender encountered two distinct schools of thought. So one is that the current administration is a dramatic, radical departure from what has come before it. And the second is to see it as a natural extension or logical extension or natural culmination of long-standing processes, namely deepening economic inequality, the corporate capture of our democracy, which you also talk about, and of course our long and undeniable history of upholding racism and defending white supremacy. So my question is, are these threats to the political order in fact new? Or are they the results of long-standing processes, or does it depend on who you ask?
Well, I'm going to punt a little bit and say both. I mean, the important thing for me is that we are able to recognize a moment when we do things or when we ought to do things that we wouldn't have done a moment before. And I'm very sympathetic, and I agree with my African American friends and colleagues who say, this is just the same thing, but maybe turned in a slightly different direction so that you've happened to notice it, right? I'm very sympathetic to that point. But in political terms, and this is a political book, we need to be able to agree, as many of us as possible, that this is a moment where we need to do something. We need to do something. Now, let me try to answer the question by saying I think there's some things here that are new, but I think some of the best ways to fight them is by remembering the old, right? I mean, so the whole method of this book is not to say Tim Snyder understands the 20th century. The whole method of this book is to say Victor Klemperer or Václav Havel or other people who experienced moments that were in some way like ours left us interesting things to think with. And I think those things still work. In fact, I think I'm seeing them work among some Americans in 2018. But I think there are some new things or some things which we haven't seen for a while. One of them is economic inequality on this scale. So we've now reached a point where the top decile in America owns about 78% of the wealth, whereas we're getting up to the Russian standard, which is 87%. If we measure the wealth that the top 0.1% of Americans owned, we've now reached where we were in 1929. This is extremely significant. I think it's quite significant that, and you know all this, but I'll mention it anyway, it's quite significant that for 90% of the American population, there's been no positive change in wealth or income since 1980, which basically means we've produced a couple of generations now where this idea of social advancement or the American dream isn't there. That is an explanation. That is something which it's crept up on us, but that is an explanation for Mr. Trump, and in general for a kind of politics which, rather than promising something in the future, only promises the past, right? Another thing which is new is the internet, right? And it's new basically in a bad way. I mean, I'm happy to discuss this back and forth, but I think basically a bad thing. I mean, all told, basically a bad thing, at least in politics, basically a bad thing. Havel and Klemperer didn't have to deal with the internet. It's now possible to reach more quickly to more people's most basic anxieties, fears, and prejudices than it was before. And it's more possible with modern forms of propaganda to tailor your message to what you think people will already want to hear. So there is something new, I think, about the contradictory character of a lot of propaganda, right? The Russians, for example, have no problem, and they did this in Ukraine and they did this to us, in saying, for example, in Ukraine they're all fascists to one demography, and then to another demography saying all of the Ukrainian state was created by the international Jewish conspiracy, right? They have no problem with that because they're targeting the message. Likewise with us, they have no problem saying to blacks, you should defend yourselves and you should buy guns, and saying to whites, you should defend yourselves and you should buy guns, right? They have no problem being completely contradictory because unlike old school propaganda, they have the technical tools to target particular groups and push them off in a certain direction. I think that's new, and it's not just them; they're just better at it than we are. But the American right does that now, as well. I mean, you see it after the school shootings in Florida, for example. This is what happens. And then the other thing, which I think is slightly new, although it happened with fascism too, is that the far right is now much more internationalist than the far left. They learn from each other, right? So when Russia invades Ukraine, the flag which is used for the pseudo-state in southeastern Ukraine under Russian occupation is the Confederate battle flag, just to take an example.
One of the things that I think is so profound about the book and the contribution that it's already made is this idea of not only of taking personal responsibility and the call to action now, but to do things that are transformative also of your surroundings. So you talk about taking care of the face of the world, pulling down the symbols of hate, not walking by a swastika and just saying, well, that's up now, but taking it down, or listening for dangerous words, and really being critical in your thinking about how words like terrorism and extremism are being used and who they're being applied to and why. And I just was thinking maybe you could say a little bit more about that, because I think one of the things that really struck me in your descriptions of Europe and the rise of fascism or Nazism there is just the incredible normalization of the daily march of dehumanization that takes place. And it takes place in this very almost banal way today, in such an onslaught of what's on the media and what comes to us, that we can just simply walk by it until it becomes the new normal. Can you speak to that?
Yeah. I mean, as a student of the Holocaust, one of the things that really worries me, troubles me about American discourse about the Second World War and Hitler is that people tend to say, well, look, we haven't killed 6 million Jews, therefore everything is fine, right? No, essentially, like if you haven't gotten all the way to the end of the Holocaust, then nothing has happened, which ignores that to get from 1933 to 1945, a whole lot of things had to happen in a certain order. We're not in 1941, but we're kind of in 1933. And in 1933, what matters is what you're talking about, Smita, which is the semiotics, the signs, the symbols, the public sphere. This is another thing which historians of Nazi Germany also agree about. I'm going to run out of the list pretty quickly, but another thing that we agree about is that the swastikas that were painted on the walls, or the Stars of David that were used to mark Jewish shops were incredibly important. That these are the things that actually enabled the regime to change. Because as you say, they instructed people what they were supposed to normalize. And this is one thing which really is a lesson that can be learned. Because at the beginning, the people who were painting the swastikas and the Stars of David, those were private initiatives, right? The SS was an NGO. No, it was. The SS was part of the Nazi Party. I mean, later it's merged with the police, and it's the main instrument of the Holocaust. And I don't mean to make light of it, but those were citizens doing one thing. One thing that Americans have done better than Germans in 1933 is that they've been more aware of their surroundings. So there are NGOs in the United States, in this city, for example, who get up early in the morning and paint over swastikas. This matters. It matters so much. It matters to all the people who don't see the swastika that day, and not just the Jews, everybody. But it also matters to the people who do the painting, because it's a very nice example of a little thing that you can do, and it's weird, right? It's maybe weird. It's maybe illegal sometimes to to paint, but doing that little thing is liberatory.
My thanks to all of you for being here, and let's carry on. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
For more on this program and other Carnegie Ethics Studio productions, visit carnegiecouncil.org. There you can find video highlights, transcripts, audio recordings, and other multimedia resources on global ethics. This program is made possible by the Carnegie Ethics Studio and viewers like you.